Hello and welcome to World Talks. I'm your host, Ayşe Abacı. Let's get right into the topic. A New York Times investigation reveals that officials inside Russia's military circles say President Putin's goal for 2026 was the collapse of NATO and the EU from within. And the central focus of this effort would be Moldova and the degradation of its Western-leaning government. And we are joined by Mark Toth, co-founder of Interep 360, to shed light on the importance of Moldova for the Kremlin, the EU and NATO. Hello, sir. Thank you very much for joining us.
Honored to join you, Ayşe. Thank you.
So let's start with what the Times report says. They say Moscow paid Orthodox priests, conducted a vote-buying scheme and set up training camps on election interference in Moldova. Tell us why this would cause a collapse of NATO and the EU, according to the Kremlin.
Yeah, I think to answer that question, you have to go back to the beginning of the war in Ukraine, back in 2022. My colleague and I, Colonel John Sweet, we wrote about that one of Putin's aims was not just to conquer Ukraine itself, but to create a land bridge from Russia stretching through Ukraine, through Odessa, into Transnistria, and then into Moldova in terms of creating a dagger against the European Union as well as NATO. And Moldova is key to that. And so while right now we just see the Moldova piece of it, it was indeed a long-term plan of Putin's to have this territory back in Russian hands. And so from his standpoint, he believes, I think he was overestimating his ability to accomplish it, that by securing Moldova, that he could then use it as a launching pad, if you will, for future operations, particularly against Romania, Poland to the north, et cetera.
But obviously they didn't achieve this goal of disrupting the Western-leaning government. But will Russia actually give up on this goal?
Yeah, it's clear in 2025, Putin was looking at doing this. He obviously prioritized it. Multiple Western intelligence agencies have confirmed that a meeting did take place where Putin basically said, look, 2026 needs to be the year that we figure out a way to collapse NATO and the EU from within. And Moldova was front and center of that strategy. That said, I think there's also other reasons behind Putin doing this. He is a cornered man in Ukraine. His armies are basically stagnated in the Donbass. They can't advance. His economy is under immense attack by deep strikes from Ukraine hitting his oil and gas industry. We've just seen the recent events, with the wild berries, their Amazon-like distribution centers being attacked. And I think he also saw, by trying to make some kind of progress in a country like Moldova, that it could be good PR for him inside of Russia, as well as to hopefully try to scare the NATO countries into saying, maybe we shouldn't stand by Ukraine as closely. I get the plan. I get why Putin is doing it. He came close in some ways to achieving the first part of it, which was to topple Sandu, as well as her party, from power, as well as to upset the referendum on the accession, if you will, of Moldova to the European Union, but he failed. I think even if he had won that, though, I think he's overreaching himself. He can't even go kilometers in Ukraine. I don't think, other than hybrid types of warfare, he's not going to be able to accomplish much anytime soon in Europe.
So more than a PR campaign, you don't think that Moldova could become Russia's next military target? I mean, there is Transnistria. Russia does have some of its armed forces over there. What are we looking at here? If they did this in 2025 with such force, I mean, it wasn't just meddling, digitally. It was really conducting operations against Moldovan elections. Could we look at a bigger, actually, intervention, a military intervention in Moldova?
Right. No, you're correct to point it out. Look, this was a massive effort on the part of the Russians. If you just look at the election interference alone, they contacted upwards of 150,000 people. The eventual votes were only decided by slightly more than 50%. That would have created a political victory, not a military one for Putin, and it would have been a future staging ground for him. But Russia is a force projection power, meaning its ability to transport troops, et cetera, is highly dependent on rail. It's not not doesn't have a massive airlift capability, such that it does. It's being used in the Middle East as well as the Sahel in Africa to support its paramilitary forces. It really doesn't have, with Ukraine standing in the way, an ability to get a massive number of troops, equipment, et cetera, that it would be needed to basically invade Moldova. That was his plan in 2022. And as I pointed out, John Sweet and I warned about that, but Ukraine stopped that, thank God. And it's just not a foreseeable possibility now. Now, does Russia still want to do that? Absolutely. Is that still the goal for Putin? 100%.
So let's do a little deep dive here, Mark. In the article, we see that according to Kremlin's hierarchy, so this is Western intelligence officials saying that Kremlin's hierarchy of priorities, conquering Ukraine is first, and then taking Moldova under its control is second. Though it's not a member of European Union or NATO, it is strategically located, squeezed between NATO members and Ukraine. Can we talk a little bit about Moldova's importance, once again, for Russia, for really our viewers to understand why this was such a strategic target for Russia, why Western officials are saying that it is second in its hierarchy of priorities?
Right. Its geography is principally why, because it creates a dagger, if you will, that's pointing up into Central Europe, both at Romania to the west, but also, towards Poland and the Baltic states to the north. From that standpoint, if Russia were able to introduce a significant amount of troops in there, it would get them closer, assuming, of course, that they control Ukraine, to be able to get to Poland. And for them to be able to do that, it basically was a way of moving westward from where they're at. It was also, ultimately the western anchor, if you will, of this land bridge that Putin had hoped to build across Ukraine, across the Black Sea, that would have enabled him to dominate the Black Sea completely, and shutting off Ukraine and potentially Western Europe as well, and the EU is using it as ports leading through the Dardanelles and Turkey, out into the Mediterranean. So geography-wise, it's very good. In theory, it made sense, and that's why we were concerned about it back in 2022. However, Putin just lacks the military capability at this point to make good on that. However, he's still trying to set conditions for it. I think what we've seen since 2025, when he had this idea of setting the political conditions, not so much the military conditions yet, he's really taking more of a hybrid warfare against all of Europe for his initial stage of military actions in the form of sabotage, espionage, and the like.
Mm-hmm. And the Moldovan parliamentary elections were on September 28th, 2025. Just like you said, Mrs. Sandu's party won with just over 50% of the vote. But was that an actual failure for Russia, or did they actually gain something from all of these operations? Did they actually uncover that they could have massive influence on the country? And are they still continuing with this influence to pull Moldova further into their zone of influence?
Ayşe, it's a great question, because I think you have to give credit where credit is due. Anytime that you can cause an election, even in a country that does have a fairly large pro-Russian population, anytime that you can create an election that close, then your campaign, your disinformation campaign, has been effective. And it wasn't just disinformation campaign. There were training centers in Serbia and Bosnia the Russians were conducting, paying people $400 a day to stay there to learn how to stage disruptions at polling places for the diaspora voting outside of the country of Moldova in the election. There were online campaigns. There were payments to priests, somewhere upwards of $1,000 on debit, credit cards, et cetera, in order for them to tell their parishes that, look, the West is terrible, the ideology is terrible, and you need to be voting for a pro-Russian conservative type government. So they came close, and I think it's something that not just Moldova, but all of Europe needs to be paying attention to, is that Russia is actively, engaged in trying to destroy not just Moldova, but the European Union itself and each individual country from within. Now, on the good news, though, is that now we have a massive blueprint, not just people like me from an analyst standpoint that were worried and warning about this back in 2022. Now it's coming to light so that the average voter, the typical voter, can see that Russia very much is trying to steal their vote from them and to cast it in favor of Moscow.
But I suppose that Russia also does have a blueprint on how to influence these formerly Soviet countries that are now trying to be more pro-European. I'm thinking here of Armenia. And after the Moldovan elections, Russia did try to have a massive amount of influence on Armenian elections as well. Although there we could say that they failed too. But so is this Russia's strategy to interfere more and more into the politics of formerly Soviet member states that are now Western-leaning? Will we see this more often?
Yeah, no, that's a great, insightful question because, look, clearly, you know, the CSTO, the Russian equivalent, if you will, of NATO, has been falling apart. Armenia has pulled away from it, and Russia is desperately trying to figure out how to get back these empires. I mean these lost pieces of their empire. Putin, at the beginning, a very big lover of history, has been wanting to assemble the Peter the Great empire in countries like Ukraine, Chechnya, Georgia, Armenia. Are all central and core to that. However, you know, the good news here is, as close as he's come to that, and in terms of the cost, unfortunately, that it's meant for the populations there, including using migrants as weapons to try to destabilize these countries, especially Poland, for instance, is that Putin continues to fail. The CSTO is much weaker 4.5 years into this war than it was at the beginning of it. It's basically become a paper entity without much military punch. So whereas it was designed to be a counterpunch, if you will, to NATO, now it's, you know, pretty much a joke, and it's not succeeding along the lines that he wanted to. That said, Russia's not going to give up here, and countries like Armenia and Moldova and other European countries need to be on their guard because he's going to keep trying.
So just like you said, Russia is not going to give up. And the more Russia, like the CSTO, is falling apart, or other entities of Russia are falling apart, this big Russian bear might actually becoming more aggressive. So how can the West and these countries that are Western-leaning protect themselves from more aggressive Russia? And what could a more aggressive Russia actually look like?
Yeah, I think in the short term, what you'll see in terms of a Russia that's aggressive is more of what we've been seeing in the hybrid warfare. You know, for instance, the explosive drone that was sitting beside in Leipzig in Germany, the Ukrainian airliner, those kind of actions, the attacking of warehouses, ransomware, you know, holding Western firms and hospital systems, educational systems hostage. I think Europe has to come to terms with that there is a real war happening behind their borders, and that Russia has been behind it. I mean, they've used their shadow fleet, for instance, to launch drones in and around the Baltic states, you know, into northern Germany, in the like, as far away as into the UK and the United Kingdom. And so there's got to be a growing recognition of that. I think the best way to answer your question here as we close this out is that NATO also needs to understand that they need to go on offense here. Kurt Volker, you know, for instance, just said a good way to do that. Instead of waiting for Russia to attack us, we need to start interdicting these drones that are hitting Western Ukraine, you know, 150 to 200 kilometers from NATO's borders. That would be a good way of pushing Russia back on its heels and instead of letting them attack the West, you know, with impunity.
Absolutely. Stronger defense on the borders. Mark Toth, co-founder of Interep 360. Thank you so much for your invaluable insights.
My honor. Thank you.
And thank you for watching this episode of World Talks. But don't go anywhere just yet. Another one coming right up.